Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm a county supervisor over here in Johnson County. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we're going to be talking about swine industry in Iowa and swine production issues. But before we do, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our show. Iowa News and Views is a community affairs program brought to you in 14 different Iowa communities. We're going into about 350,000 households and we've got about 1 million viewers. Well, maybe 1 million. If everybody were watching in all those 350,000 households every week, we'd probably have 1 million. So you be sure to continue to tune in, and we encourage you to tell your friends about us too. Iowa News and Views is trying to address community and state issues and provide a forum for the discussion of those concerns. If you have an idea for a guest or a show, please send us some email. We're going to give you some information about how to do that in the future. So no flipping. We are about a year old this month, February 1998. We've been on for 12 months. I'd like to say happy birthday to the show and to the crew for doing the hard work. I'd like now to get to our show. We have with us Kendall Thu, who's a research scientist for the Institute of Rural Environmental Health at the University of Iowa. Kendall, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Joe.
Kendall, you've been doing some research on the swine industry for a number of years now. Give us a little bit about your background and why you have come to be known on this issue.
Well, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, strangely enough, but I'm employed primarily at the Institute for Rural Environmental Health, which is located within the College of Medicine here at the University of Iowa. The Institute has been around since 1955, researching and doing outreach programming on issues related to human and rural environmental health problems in Iowa. And since about 1993, when I first started working for the Institute, issues surrounding swine production and changes in the swine industry in Iowa have come to the fore, and we have been contacted by numerous groups and private individuals around the state of Iowa for information on a broad range of issues related to changes in the swine industry, and as a result we've gotten involved in research and education in environmental areas, human health issues related to people who work inside the facility, the social health of communities where large-scale facilities are located, as well as economic issues, particularly economic development issues related to the viability of rural communities. So we've gotten involved because of our mandate in the state, and we're trying to provide the research data that can inform policy decisions throughout the region.
Very good. Well, this issue has been the foremost issue, I think, in the state of Iowa over the last number of years. How the state's changing, in particular agricultural production. You'd have to be living in a cave not to have read about this particular issue and be kind of clued in. Right. What are some of the key research issues now as it relates to your work and in particular on this issue?
Well, there are a broad range of issues, but we divide them into 5 specific areas, and we like people to think of concerns related to the swine industry as related to one of these 5 areas. They include environmental issues. That's both air quality and water quality issues. That's one area. A second area is the health of communities, the social health, that is how people get along with each other. There's an economic issue, that is the financial viability of farming and rural communities that depend so much on agriculture. That's a third area. The fourth area is the health of workers who work inside these facilities. We're very concerned by considerable research that shows a large segment of the population that works inside these facilities are suffering disproportionate rates of certain kinds of chronic diseases. The fifth area is one that I sort of refer to as political health. What happens when you have a concentration of a precious resource like food into fewer and fewer hands, and what that does for not only the political health of a state like Iowa, but what happens in a nation as a whole. So those are the areas that we're concerned with, and we like to think of them as interlocking issue areas.
So Iowa's been a leader in swine production for a number of years, and you know,
Right.
it's been a couple years or several years ago that we made a decision to allow these mega operations to come into our state, which has kind of been the beginning point of
Right.
of our problems, or at least the perceived problems.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, you know, swine production is nothing new in Iowa. We've, as is often cited in the news media, we've led the country in pork production for 120 years, and we haven't had much of a problem with that until 5, 6, 7 years ago, when a certain style of pork production came to the state, and that's a style of production that's often referred to as large-scale swine production. But we often do not say what large-scale swine production means, and so it's fairly misleading sometimes, and it's difficult for people to get their arms around this issue because so many people have different definitions of large-scale. So when we talk about large-scale, we have something fairly specific in mind, and it's not numbers of pigs, it's the way the ownership structure is put together. Large scale in our definition, and what we're most concerned about, are those facilities where you have absentee ownership, you have people who do not have a vested interest in the community owning or managing these firms. You have the labor and the management and the ownership are divorced from each other, whereas in independent family farms, those are integrated into one community, into one entity. You have a very capital intensive, technologically intensive operation, and then you have operations that don't have a vested interest in the community and the land surrounding these facilities to the same extent as people who live there. So those are the kinds of considerations that we, or the kinds of characteristics that we ascribe to when we're talking about large-scale facilities.
Sure. And we used to have laws in the state that prevented that, it's my understanding, that kind of ownership structure of out-of-state folks owning these kinds of operations in farm ground in Iowa. We changed that to let the big guys, so to speak, in. Was that a mistake?
I think it was a mistake, and it's continuing to show itself as a mistake. And back in 1975, when Iowa passed its first corporate farming law, we had over 60 legislators signing on to that legislation, including then a young legislator by the name of Terry Branstad. Since then, there's been a continual erosion of those corporate farming laws and creation of more loopholes that allow these firms who don't have the same interests in rural communities come in and sort of wreak havoc with our rural communities, the social, economic, and environmental health of these communities. And I think also that by coming in and creating this havoc, they're creating a bad reputation for reputable pork producers who actually, those reputable pork producers constitute the vast majority of pork producers out there. So it's been a bad deal all the way around.
Well, in that it raises the issues about how do you begin to regulate such a diverse industry where, you know, the smaller producers are concerned that state government, in this case, might do something that is that's going to hurt them by trying to regulate this other problem, and that's become a real issue, particularly where it relates to the issue of local control.
Right, and a very understandable concern, and one that I think that legislators have to be very cognizant of. I think, though, that one of the key points that maybe pork producers as a whole have missed, and certainly I think the pork producer organizations have missed, is that whenever you get into a pickle, the first thing you do is you trust the people out there to make the best decision for what's going to go on. You don't suddenly pit yourself against local communities or the populace generally, and then you back yourself into a corner and you have it's very difficult to get out. So in this particular issue, the best course is to say, well, let's trust the people to do what's right. And in that regard, I think the best ally of the vast majority of pork producers who are responsible producers and who contribute so much to our rural communities is to say, look, people out in rural communities and rural counties know what's best for their community, and they're not going to turn their backs on that segment of the farm population that served them well for so many decades.
a number of years ago here in Iowa, late 80s, there was a law passed that gave city councils and county boards of supervisors local control over landfill siting decisions and local control over medical waste incinerators. A number of years ago, that was a big issue around the state, and people felt like local folks ought to make decisions about, the future impacts of those kinds of facilities. It seems like this is really the same question to me.
That's right. And again, when there's a volatile issue like this and very emotional, that's the time when you turn to the people and trust them most. That's the premise of the society and the decision-making process that we've set up. I think we need to rely on that here and realize that these communities, these local boards of supervisors, ought to be a conduit now for making these fundamental decisions, particularly decisions about the siting of these facilities. Not necessarily unilateral control over everything that has to do with the construction operation of these facilities, but they ought to have a decisive voice in the siting of these facilities. So, and I agree that until that happens, we're going to continue to deal with issues that are really window dressing or cosmetic, and the problem will continue to foment and the pressure cooker will build.
I know that the Iowa State Association of Counties, which is the organization that represents boards of supervisors, doesn't really have a position on local control. They've kind of wanted to stay out of it. I think that's unfortunate that we, the counties, have not been able to speak in a unified voice on that.
Well, I can tell you it was 4 or 5 years ago I spoke at the annual meeting of the Iowa State Association of Counties, and in a general assembly of county supervisors, I asked the assembly hall who they thought ought to be making decisions about the siting of these facilities. And this is really before the local control issue came to the fore and everybody staked out their position. And I took a poll of the county supervisors, and there were I don't know how many county supervisors there are on the state, but there were a great deal of them there. And I asked them whether the state legislature ought to be making decisions about whether these things should be cited or whether it should be in the hands of county supervisors. By far and away, it wasn't even close, the county supervisors voted that they ought to have decisive say in where these things were cited. And of course now we've evolved into politically entrenched positions, and those kinds of sentiments or views on the issue have become distorted. But I think if you talk to most county supervisors in the hallways and away from lobbyists and other groups who have pursued their position, I think they would probably agree.
Very good. You're watching Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. We're visiting with Kendall Thu, who's a research scientist with the Institute of Rural Environmental Health at the University of Iowa, and we're talking about swine production. Before we get back to the show, I'd like to remind you to check out our webpage. It has some interesting facts about the show, how you can send us some ideas on future guests, future content for shows, and see some pictures of the crew and just generally see what we're up to. Also, we'll show you our email address here if we could, and you can email us if you got the electronic mail thing going. We're always interested in your email, and send us some. We'd like to see it. And remember, no flipping. This is important. You want to pay attention now. Okay, back to Kendall. Kendall, one of the things that I've read of some research that you've done looks at the issue of number of producers, smaller producers, medium-sized producers, and how the health of rural Iowa is greatly impacted and benefited by having more people producing than fewer.
Right. Well, that's absolutely right. If you read the reports on the swine industry in Iowa, the primary measure that's used as an index of industry health is always the number of hogs that we produce. And that is the final denominator by which we determine the health. Well, that's very misleading because there's 50 years worth of rural social science research that shows that having more producers rather than more hogs or more any other commodity is the real key to rural economic health. And it just makes sense because the more people you have out there doing the job of producing a particular commodity like hogs, the more likely those resources are going to stay in the community and get spent in local grocery stores and local retail establishments. There's one other part of that that's important to keep in mind, and that's the issue of efficiency. We often hear that these larger scale facilities are inherently more efficient. Well, some of them are efficient, but by efficient what they mean is that they use very capital intensive technology to displace jobs. So they're producing more of this commodity with less people. So it's incorrect to say therefore they are creating jobs, because by their very nature they're displacing jobs. The goal of these outfits is to reduce the number of people required to produce X amount of hogs. So you can't both produce more hogs or produce more jobs and be more efficient. It doesn't work.
So it's not the number of hogs produced.
No.
It's the number of people producing
That's
those
right.
hogs. It's really
People over pigs, that's right.
people over pigs. Sometimes when I talk to people, they feel like it's inevitable that we're going to have fewer people on the land, fewer people farming. Is it inevitable? I mean, what can we
not.
do as a state to establish policies that keep people on the land?
Absolutely not. It's not inevitable. By casting it as inevitable, you cast a sort of shroud of there's nothing I can do about it, and that's not true. We need strong corporate farming policies in this state. We need a research agenda that focuses on a broad range of production forms, so we don't get locked into one style, and so we have a range of variation that can be adapted to various environments. We need policies that reward smaller and independent farmers. We need tax policies that don't penalize independent farmers. We need tax policies that are not used by larger firms as tools to train workers in these facilities, for example, and give unfair advantages. So there are a number of things that can be done, and it all starts from leadership. It starts from political leadership. It's not an inevitable economic process. It's a matter of deciding what course we want to take. And currently we have a very limited vision of what we want to do in terms of our agricultural opportunity.
Sure. Political leadership is an important element of this, and I'd have to say that I think to a large degree it's been lacking over the last couple legislative sessions. There's been kind of like, we passed this law and we're just going to have to see how it works, even though it's pretty clear to most people in rural Iowa it's not working. There seems to be a push this legislative session back towards the question of local control. But even with local control, do we need to revisit our state's agricultural laws and figure out a way to turn this back where these mega operations are concerned? Is that even possible at this point?
Oh, I think it's absolutely possible. Not only possible, I think it's necessary. I think I agree with you that we've gone through a series of stopgap measures of trying to deal with this issue without any vision of what we want for our agricultural future. You know, we talk a lot about the need to develop export markets, value-added agriculture, but can we get back to talking about who we want producing our food and what we want for rural communities? I think without a vision of where we want to get to, it's very hard to get beyond these very myopic discussions of individual issues that sort of sidetrack us from the overarching business.
So we lack a vision about how we want to produce food in this state and about how we want to structure our rural economy.
Do we want non-family corporations to dominate food production in this state? Let's discuss that very fundamental issue. Or do we want to put resources and policy energies into promoting independent family farms? And that's not an issue of a romantic Grant Wood sense of what we want in Iowa. It's an issue of economic viability for rural communities. It's an issue of environmental health for rural communities, and it's an issue of maintaining a strong, established stake in our land for the political, the foundation of our political freedoms that come with making sure that we have land distributed equitably and food resources distributed equitably.
So concern about just the concentration of those things and some of the fallouts from that. It seems like in Iowa the policy, if you're a big corporation, our arms are wide open for you and we'll do whatever we can do to get you going here. But if you're a little guy trying to make it, it seems tougher. And it seems like that's the dichotomy here.
Well, I think that's probably true in agriculture, that if you look at the numbers, it's certainly been tough on independent producers. If you consider them a small business, they've been falling by the wayside in droves, and I think we need to do something actively to stem that tide.
So this back to the concentration in the food production business. What are some of the concerns there?
Well, the food is, as an anthropologist, I've studied food production systems and human adaptation around the world. And food is not like any other commodity that we produce. It's not like computers or telephones or vacuum cleaners or toasters, where you see concentration in certain manufacturing sectors and other sectors that people are concerned about. Food is more fundamental, and land is more fundamental in the shape of a society. Where you have a concentration in food production, you generally have concentration of political power. That's fundamental political power. If you look in the corridors of Washington, D.C. and see where all the agribusiness lobbyists reside and see the kind of influence they have, and what would happen down the road if we have the continuation of this concentration, it's not a pretty picture. We have approximately 50% of all the farmland in this country is owned by 4% of the farmland owners, and most of those don't live on or operate the farm.
Wow.
And that's a very disturbing picture. A Jeffersonian democracy is based on equitable distribution of land and food production resources.
Now, by way of comparison, Nebraska has not changed their corporate agriculture laws. They pretty much prevent the kind of mega operations from coming into their state.
Right.
How's the health of Nebraska these days, in rural Nebraska, as it compares to Iowa?
Well, Nebraska has not seen the same level of decline in numbers of producers that we've seen in states that have weaker corporate farming laws. If you look at a state like North Carolina that has virtually no corporate farming laws and sort of leads the country in the genesis of these large-scale hog operations, or these corporate hog operations, they've lost independent hog producers at a rate that far surpasses any other state in the country. And yet their hog numbers has risen dramatically faster than any other state. Nebraska, on the other hand, is more concerned with the numbers of hog producers rather than the number of hogs, and they have been able to stabilize the number of producers more so than other states, and it's because they haven't become caught up in this whirlwind of measuring their industry health by the number of hogs they produced. So that we ought to learn from that.
So it seems like, I know here in Johnson County we have a number of farmers that have created some bigger operations. They're essentially family farming operations, but have we seen an increase or an acceleration in this kind of desire to got to get bigger to stay competitive against these very large outfits?
Yeah, there is some of that, and it's unfortunate. What's happening now is that, of course, there is this treadmill effect where you have to produce more to make enough money given the slim profit margins to survive. But the pressures that small producers are feeling, or independent producers are feeling, are coming from these large outfits that are not responding to market pressures. They're creating them themselves. And so they're sort of, despite the fact that the domestic demand for pork hasn't risen much at all, they're kicking out a lot more hogs, and they're flooding the market. And we're seeing now what happens when you have a surplus. You have a decline in prices, just like we had back in '94,
right.
And that puts independent producers at a disadvantage. They're going to have to come up with creative ways to carve out their own niches.
So most of the folks that are watching this program live in cities, in urban Iowa. What's the handle on this for folks that live in town? Why should they be concerned?
They should be concerned because the people who are producing their food, they want to be responsible producers. And who's most likely going to produce food that's best for their children? Who's most likely going to be producing that food in areas that are not going to be contaminating the water that comes through their tap, their faucet? And who's most likely to contribute to their state and their communities in a way that promotes the cultural heritage of this state? And I think on all of those counts, The answer is family farms, and that's an issue that urban dwellers should take a great deal of interest in.
Surely. The water quality issue has obviously been a big urban issue, and impacts in rural Iowa certainly of concern. Are we doing enough in that area, or there's some additional things that we should be looking at?
No, we're not doing nearly enough in that area. If you look at the number of these large-scale facilities that are going up, the amount of hog manure that are put in the manure lagoons that are constructed on these facilities, compared with the level of concern over ground and surface water contamination, we don't know much at all about what the potential or actual effect of these facilities is on surface and groundwater contamination, despite an extreme level of concern demonstrated in various surveys and focus group work in rural areas. So we are way short of the mark in trying to give proper information to people on water quality.
Sure. Kendall, we're about out of time. I appreciate you being our guest this evening and talking about the swine industry in Iowa. It's obviously a very important issue to rural Iowa, but to urban Iowa as well. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
We've just been talking with Kendall Thu, a researcher at the Institute of Rural Environmental Health. I'd like to thank our crew, our donors, and our local sponsors around the state for making this show possible. You've been watching Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. Remember, this is just a TV program, and what's important is what you're doing each and every day in your community to make Iowa a better place. Kendall Thu's working in his world to do that. We encourage you to get out there and do it too. Thanks. See you next time.